I'm going to grind this handle out. It's a full tang knife, and it's ironwood handle. I just need to go in, and this is obviously another knife, and it has that style of handle in there, so need to grind down to it and hand sand and file and work this handle out. Alright, it's profiled. Got down to the steel everywhere. This ironwood's looking really pretty, and it's only at like an 80 grit finish, so ironwood usually looks good once it gets finished out. It's such a hard wood, it takes a really high polish and looks great. So now I need to go in and get rid of these edges and do some contouring in here. And also this is at 80 grit, all the steel is, so I'll have to go around and get that down to like 600 grit before I hand sand it out and polish it. So you can kind of see the shape we have going here. I go in and taper from a kind of a central point here forward, and then go in and concave this out. So basically you have a line here in the center of your hand, mainly separating these two big chunks of meat. And you want this line, and sometimes, you know, angular, whatever, depending on how you like doing them, you want it to kind of end up right in your hand there. So that's kind of the intention. This is still rough. I need to go in and refine it, but you can see the shape that I'm going for there. Alright, so I've gone in and knocked these off, the corners. And one thing I like to do is I like to start out flat. I don't like to round anything until I can make sure I can look down it and see that these angles are right. And then I've taken off equal amounts on either side. So this is still just roughed in, so it's not perfect, but basically you just want to have flat. I like to use flats. I mean, some people probably start off by rounding these, but if you flat them, I think you can get it looking a lot more symmetrical. So I mean, it already feels good right after knocking those corners off. I've gone in and kind of clean things up on the lower grit belt. Right now we're at 80 grit and then 600 along the steel. So that's about as close as I'm going to get it on the grinder. I don't believe in grinding to finish, so I'm going to go in with files now and refine, get everything symmetric and cleaned up and smoothed out, and then I'll move on to sandpaper. And the butt I don't finish, well, the heel, the butt, whatever, I don't finish that until like the end. Like, I'll get the rest of this thing sanded pretty much all the way done, and then I'll go in and kind of dome that just to maintain these edges, because while I'm working with the file and sandpaper and stuff, it's really easy to knock these off, and then the knife loses its nice sharp look. So we'll go file it off and hand sand now. So basically with the file I'm going in and rounding over edges. This knife handle I'm going to do smooth. I like smoother knife handles because, well, there's not edges digging into your hand anywhere. Knife handles can look really good if you've got, you know, facets on them, flats with hard edges, they look good. But for something like this that's more functional, I prefer to just round it out. I think it feels a lot better and fits more hands better. So basically with the file, I'm going to go in and round out and smooth up things while maintaining, you know, symmetrical geometry on either side. So this is the side off of the grinder, and then this is after filing. You can see how things are rounded out, smoothed out. There's still a line here, and that looks kind of good, so I like to keep that in some of my knives, just depends. So that's why I like to go in with a file and clean things up. I think that it helps a lot, and I don't think that you can get that great of a finish right off of the grinder. Maybe some people can, I don't know. I've never had luck with it. I'd rather do it by hand. I think that you generally end up with a better product when you do things by hand. So now I'll go in and do this side, and then it'll be time to move on to sandpaper. Alright, so I've gone in and done a lot of this with 500 grit. Another thing, if you want to keep things flat, if you have a certain part, like on this I want to keep this flat and kind of crisp, it'll have a little bit of a line. I'm not going to touch that. Right now this has just been done with the file, and the rest of this is up to 500 grit. So I'll get the rest of this up to 800 grit, and then I'll come in with 500 and do this, and then do it with 800. That way you keep these crisper lines. And with the 500 grit I can take a little bit more off and re-crisp those lines if they got wore out at all from the rest of the sanding. So now I need to go in and get the spine, or the steel, the full tang part, polished out. Well, not polished, but sanded up to 800 or 1000 grit. And then I can go in and finish this out. This is 500 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going in trying to just get the wood basically to where there's no edge, because the further you move it back there's an edge, and there's always an edge pretty much until you get to the steel, but you don't want to round over your spine. You want it flat because reasons. So I'm just trying to knock off that little bit of an edge here, shoestringing it really, shoe polishing, whatever you want to call it. Normally you would always want to have a backer. Pretty much any sanding you're doing, you want to use a backer. Have a file behind it, have wood behind it, and then you would go in and do that. But for this, I want them round, and I'm not taking off much. I'm just barely getting rid of that. And then I'll go in and sand out the actual steel. We're at 1000 grit. Now I'm going to take it over to the buffer, and this is not the final. polish that'll go to, or grit. I'll take it over to the buffer, and that'll really show me if I have any scratches left over anywhere. I'll inspect the whole thing from every bad angle to the best of my ability and try and find any scratches or low spots. And then I'll sand it out to 1500 grit, and then it'll get its final buff. I think that step is important, buffing it and then going back and resanding it, because it's really tough to tell on softer materials where your scratches are and what grit you're really at. So I think it helps to go buff, find those spots, look at it, from, like I said, every bad angle. That's really the trick to making knives. If you want to make nice knives, not saying that I make nice knives, but if you want to, then you have to look at your knives from every bad angle and look for those scratches and those problems and then work to fix them. So that's why I go in and do a kind of a pre-buff before I go to my final grit on sanding. And sometimes you have to go back. I had to go back on this guy on the file to clean up the heel. I haven't cleaned up the back of the heel yet, but I had something out of whack here, so I had to go back, put it on the grinder, 80 grit, file, 500 grit, and finish it out. So you just have to do that. I mean, you don't have to, but that's really the point here. If you want to get better and make better knives, you have to be willing to go back and fix your mistakes or try and fix them on the next one and really be critical of yourself. I think anyway, but I don't really know anything, so. I just buffed it, and it looks pretty good. I mean, it looks neat, looks shiny, looks hard. That's the big thing. When you sand things out and buff them, they look really hard, kind of glassy. So, like I was saying, I buffed it to go in and find scratches. I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see any of this because this stuff's pretty minor, but there's a scratch right here in front of my thumb. And then there's another one right over here on the other side, kind of in the same spot there. And I just missed it. That happens, and it's tough to tell. So then I go in and buff it and look at the entire thing. And you can see how the light moves across it. I use that a lot. If there's a deep scratch somewhere or something I missed, I'll usually see it because of that. So now I'll go back, get those out, and then on the final buff it'll get inspected again. Usually they're good to go on the final buff. So, yeah, that's kind of the point of doing that. Looks pretty good though, huh? This guy's at 1500 grit. Now I'm going to do the final buff on it. So, we'll see what that looks like. So I'm going to call that finished. So I went up to 1500 grit, buffed it out a little bit with white rouge. Looks pretty good. This is desert ironwood, by the way. I don't know if I said that earlier, but this is desert ironwood. So yeah, looks pretty good. I'm happy with it. I mean, I guess as happy as I'm going to get. Man, the spot in here is like super dark. That looks neat. And I haven't cleaned it yet. It hasn't been all washed up and gone in with Q-tips and toothpicks and cleaned everything up, but that's basically what it's going to look like. Now I need to... Oh no. Look at how sad that knife is. Oh, alright. Well, that looks great, huh? Oh man, I'm going to have to go and refinish the whole thing now.